Greetings and welcome to the Bible Paladin, where we read the sacred scriptures and reflect on the Word of God in our lives today. Up until now, we have been following the story of Abram and Sarai, and we keep hearing about this promise that God has given them. But also up to this point, we have not yet seen it fulfilled.
Still waiting?
Indeed. And so today we'll be looking at chapters 17 and 18 of Genesis, and I invite you to follow along. As always, we'll be doing some historical commentary, and then see how it can be fit into a theological context that is meaningful today. We pick up about 13 years after the last chapter when we were told that Ishmael was born and Abram was 86 years old. The story today begins with a 99-year-old Abram, and this will be the last time that God repeats that promise that he will be the father of a great nation. At this point, however, Abram probably thinks that it's a big joke.
Well, what am I, a joke?
And he even laughs this time. Wait, you might be thinking, I thought it was Sarah who laughed. And you would be right. But as we've seen in many of the stories of Genesis, there were two versions of the story that have been put together and form one narrative back to back. And both of these versions have been kept as canon, as real stories of this interaction between God, Abram, and Sarai, because they each tell very different aspects of the importance of this story and what they mean for the history and the ancestors. And so we end up seeing two beautiful Annunciation narratives that come together to show how great this promise is about the great nation of Israel. And so let us read the text. I pray that God may open our hearts and minds as we read these sacred words. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, I am God the Almighty. Walk in my presence and be blameless. Between you and me I will establish my covenant, and I will multiply you exceedingly. When Abram prostrated himself, God continued to speak to him. My covenant with you is this. You are to become the father of a host of nations. No longer shall you be called Abram. Your name shall be Abraham. For I am making you the father of a host of nations. I will render you exceedingly fertile. I will make nations of you. Kings shall stem from you. I will maintain my covenant with you and your descendants after you throughout the ages as an everlasting pact, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you. I will give to you and your descendants after you the land in which you are now staying, the whole land of Canaan, as a permanent possession, and I will be their God. God also said to Abraham, on your part, you and your descendants after you must keep my covenant throughout the ages. This is my covenant with you and your descendants after you that you must keep. Every male among you shall be circumcised. Circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and that shall be the mark of the covenant between you and me. Throughout the ages, every male among you, when he is 8 days old, shall be circumcised, including the houseborn slaves and those acquired with money from any foreigner who is not of your blood. Yes, both the houseborn slaves and those acquired with money must be circumcised. Thus my covenant shall be in your flesh as an everlasting pact. If a male is uncircumcised, that is, if the flesh of the foreskin has not been cut away, such a one shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. God further said to Abraham, as for your wife Sarai, do not call her Sarai. Her name shall be Sarah. I will bless her, and I will give you a son by her. Him also will I bless. He shall give rise to nations, and rulers of people shall issue from him. Abraham prostrated himself and laughed as he said to himself, can a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Or can Sarah give birth at 90? Then Abraham said to God, let but Ishmael live on by your favor. God replied, nevertheless, your wife Sarah is to bear you a son, and you shall call him Isaac. I will maintain my covenant with him as an everlasting pact, to be his God and the God of his descendants after him. As for Ishmael, I am heeding you. I hereby bless him. I will make him fertile and multiply him exceedingly. He shall become the father of 12 chieftains, and I will make of him a great nation. But my covenant I will maintain with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you by this time next year. When he had finished speaking with him, God departed from Abraham. Then Abraham took his son Ishmael and all his slaves, whether born in his house or acquired with his money, every male among the members of Abraham's household, and he circumcised the flesh of their foreskins on that same day, as God had told him to do. Abraham was 99 years old when the flesh of his foreskin was circumcised, and his son Ishmael was 13 years old when the flesh of his foreskin was circumcised. Thus, on that same day, Abraham and his son Ishmael were circumcised, and all the male members of his household, including the slaves born in his house or acquired with his money from foreigners, were circumcised with him. We have seen the relationship between God and Abram evolve over these narratives. At first, God speaks to Abram, and then later, Abram responds by asking questions. We have also seen the covenant or promise evolve over time. In the last few chapters, we saw God and Abram cut or make a covenant together regarding this promise. And then this time, we are told that God invites Abram to walk with him. God himself appears to Abram. We have seen that the angel of the Lord appears to Hagar when she was at her lowest. And now God himself appears to Abram, showing the importance and the closeness of their relationship. Something new is about to happen. And this is the first time that God demands an action of Abraham since he had told him to leave the land of his fathers and travel to Canaan. And this will be the rite of circumcision. Many of us have probably heard of this practice, either as a medical procedure or a religious ritual as it is still practiced today. And it may be one of the oldest surgical procedures in written history, going back almost 5,000 years. Archaeologists have found Egyptian paintings depicting this practice that date to about the 3rd century BC. This would have been practiced by the Egyptians and other tribes during the time of Abram, but not in Mesopotamia, from where Abram was from. Now, for the other groups that did practice it, it was typically used as a coming of age or fertility rite, and wouldn't be done until the boy reached the age of puberty. For Abraham, it is to be done when the child reaches the age of 8 days. And it acts as a covenant, marking them as belonging to God, saying that they are part of the same tribe, the same faith, or even the beginning of this organized religion. And like most covenants, as we have previously seen, the shedding of blood is involved. It is also important that it is on the 8th day that this would be done, for traditionally, for 7 days, the child would remain with his mother, as in Leviticus 22:27, which states that no animal shall be ready for an offering until the 8th day, when it can be separated from its mother. So too, the newborn boys are not seen as ready to enter into the covenant until such time. God, for his part, confirms that he will make good on the promise, now giving Abraham a timeline of when they are to expect their child. Just as he gave a timeline for when they will inherit the land, he now says that it will occur within a year that their son will be born. Also, to show the new relationship that they have with the Lord, God changes their names. Even though the meanings of their names remain basically the same, Abraham could be understood to mean the father of a host of nations, and Sarah still means princess. Some rabbis have said that the change in their name is actually indicative of their relationship with God, and that God gives them one of the letters of his name, the He in Hebrew. Now it is Abraham in Sarah. And so this particular letter that is from the word, the name of God, Yahweh, is now part of their names, showing that he is truly their God and they are his people. They are linked, they are joined with God in a very special way. So when God does tell Abraham that he and Sarah will have a child, Abraham begins to doubt again because he's heard this many times. Sarah's 90 and he's pushing 100. And so he proposes to God, well, why not let Ishmael be my heir? And at first, God seems to ignore this request, and now it's God's turn to laugh. He says, within a year's time, I will come back, and you two will have a child, and you will name him Isaac, which means to laugh, or he laughed. And so God is telling him that's going to be the name. And then God does address the question of Ishmael, and assures Abraham that he too will be the father of a great nation, just as he told Hagar at the well, that Ishmael will be the father of 12 chieftains, which will parallel the 12 sons of Jacob, which we'll hear about later. And then God tells him that this will come to pass within a year, and he departs from him. Abraham immediately has himself, his son, and everyone in his household circumcised. And this shows that Abraham does trust in the word of God, and he wants to fulfill his part of the covenant. And that must have been one uncomfortable and painful evening for all of the men in his household. Chapter 18 is another version of the story of Isaac's Annunciation. And while the first focused on the rite of circumcision as a sign of the covenant, this next one highlights the hospitality that Abraham and Sarah show to God, and it shows the development of the relationship that they have with him. And so we'll read this in two parts, as it really talks about two distinct conversations. But it also really shows us the importance of the virtue of hospitality that was in the ancient world and still continues in the Near East today. And so, let's continue with the story. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the terebinth of Mamre, as he sat in the entrance of his tent, while the day was growing hot. Looking up, he saw 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he ran from the entrance of the tent to greet them, and bowing to the ground, he said, "Sir, if I may ask you this favor, please do not go on past your servant. Let some water be brought, that you may bathe your feet, and then rest yourselves under the tree. Now that you have come this close to your servant, let me bring you a little food, that you may refresh yourselves, and afterward you may go on your way." "Very well," they replied. "Do as you have said." Abraham hastened into the tent and told Sarah, "Quick, 3 seahs of fine flour. Knead it and make rolls." He ran to the herd, picked out a tender, choice steer, and gave it to the servant, who quickly prepared it. Then he got some curds and milk, as well as the steer that had been prepared, and set those before them. And he waited on them under the tree while they ate. "Where is your wife Sarah?" they asked him. "There in the tent," he replied. One of them said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah will then have a son." Sarah was listening at the entrance of the tent, just behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years, and Sarah had stopped having her womanly periods. So Sarah laughed to herself and said, "Now that I am so withered and my husband is so old, am I still to have sexual pleasure?" But the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I really bear a child, old as I am?' Is there anything too marvelous for the Lord to do? At the appointed time, about this time next year, I will return to you, and Sarah will have a son." Because she was afraid, Sarah dissembled, saying, "I didn't laugh." But he said, "Yes, you did." We begin with this pastoral image of Abraham sitting outside his tent in the heat of day by the great oak when these 3 men appear. And of course, he doesn't recognize these men, but as a good host, he quickly offers them hospitality before they go on their way. Now, in many ways, this scene is similar to the scene when God approaches Adam and Eve in the garden in the cool of the day. Yet, it is the complete opposite of such a scene. Instead of hiding, Abraham runs off to prepare a meal for his guests. And Sarah, she's not hiding either, but she is near her tent and eavesdropping. For this message, of course, applies to both of them. Now, instead of coming down to offer a punishment, as God did in the garden, instead he is bringing good news. He is telling them that he has come to make good on that promise, on that covenant that they have been waiting for all of these years. And of course, when he tells the news, Sarah laughs, and God hears it and kind of rebukes her, but in a playful way, not like in the garden. For this is a joyful moment. It is a joyful time. Even when Sarah says, "No, I didn't laugh," God kind of responds with a quick, "Yes, you did." And then that laughter, well, in one sense, it means she laughed because she couldn't believe it. That laughter will be changed, because to laugh means to be surprised with joy. And this is really what will happen once that child arrives. They will be surprised with joy and finally feeling that goodness and the grace and the promise of God that they have been waiting for. And after this conversation and their meal, Abraham accompanies them as they travel towards Sodom. And this brings us the opportunity to hear a fascinating theological discussion about divine retribution and mercy. The men set out from there and looked down toward Sodom. Abraham was walking with them to see them on their way. The Lord reflected, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do, now that he is to become a great and populous nation, and all the nations of the earth are to find blessing in him? Indeed, I have singled him out that he may direct his sons and his posterity to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just, so that the Lord may carry into effect for Abraham the promises he made about him. Then the Lord said, "The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin so grave, that I must go down and see whether or not their actions fully correspond to the cry against them that comes to me. I mean to find out." While the two men walked on farther toward Sodom, the Lord remained standing before Abraham. Then Abraham drew nearer to him and said, "Will you sweep away the innocent with the guilty? Suppose there were 50 innocent people in the city. Would you wipe out the place rather than spare it for the sake of the 50 innocent people within it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to make the innocent die with the guilty, so that the innocent and the guilty should be treated alike. Should not the judge of all the world act with justice?" The Lord replied, "If I find 50 innocent people in the city of Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake." Abraham spoke up again, "See how I am presuming to speak to my Lord, though I am but dust and ashes. What if there are 5 less than 50 innocent people? Will you destroy the whole city because of those 5? "I will not destroy it," he answered, "if I find 45 there." But Abraham persisted, saying, "What if only 40 are found there?" He replied, "I will forbear doing it for the sake of the 40. Then he said, "Let not my Lord grow impatient if I go on. What if only 30 are found there?" He replied, "I will forbear doing it if I can find but 30 there." Still he went on, "Since I have thus dared to speak to my Lord, what if there are no more than 20? "I will not destroy it," he answered, "for the sake of the 20. But he still persisted, "Please let not my Lord grow angry if I speak up this last time. What if there are at least 10 there?" "For the sake of those 10, he replied, "I will not destroy it." The Lord departed as soon as he had finished speaking with Abraham, and Abraham returned home. So we see this narrative continue with this walk, where Abraham walks with God and these 2 attendants who are revealed to be angels later. And we are privy to God's thoughts as he debates with himself, it seems, whether or not to share with Abraham his plan for Sodom. And God decides that he will tell Abraham, because there's this new milestone within their relationship, and God is going to demand quite a bit of Abraham as the father of this nation. We are familiar with this particular image of God, who tends to be portrayed as more human, the gardener, the potter, the one who delights in fragrant offerings. And so he must go down and see for himself what is going on in Sodom. And in fact, it is his ambassadors, his angels, that do so as he remains and speaks with Abraham. And now, just as we heard God's thoughts, we now hear Abraham's thoughts as he debates on how he's going to approach God about what's going on. And so Abraham speaks on behalf of the people of Sodom. Perhaps is because he considers that his nephew Lot is still living there with his family, and maybe God will spare the city if he could find just some good people. Now Lot, of course, may be an ungrateful jerk, but Abraham did go after him and battled 4 kings to protect him. And so Abraham still feels that he has some responsibility for his nephew. And he may be afraid that Lot may be included in those wicked people there in Sodom. And so Abraham speaks up on behalf of Lot or of any of the innocent people that still may live in Sodom. This dialogue brings up the tension that we see throughout the Hebrew Scriptures between divine retribution, divine mercy, and corporate accountability. It is the question of whether or not everyone should be punished if not everyone is guilty. And yet we do see precedent for this. All of humanity shares in the punishment of Adam and Eve. All of creation, save one family, perished during the flood. All of Ham's descendants were cursed based on his poor judgment. Pharaoh's entire household was struck with plagues because of Abram and Sarah's lie. But Abraham has grown in wisdom and begun to think about justice and mercy and begins to question. He's like the student who wonders why the whole class is being punished because some of the kids were being bad. Do we share accountability? And so he essentially barters with God. And if you've ever been to the Middle East, you know it's quite a beautiful art. He appeals to God's sense of justice as judge of all the world. Should the innocent perish with the guilty, he asks. And Abraham gets him down from 50 to 10, so he's good at bartering. And Abraham, and perhaps the reader as well, begins to see the difference between vengeance and justice and the extent of God's mercy, which is really what we will begin to see as we continue reading through the Bible. And it's not about God changing his mind, which he doesn't, but rather about our ability to ask the tough questions. The story shows that it's okay to have these types of conversations with God, and that we're able to perhaps walk with him and share our concerns with him. As we consider these heavy conversations that God has with Abraham and Sarah, we ask ourselves, how can we grow in our faith? In the first narrative, we hear about the rite of circumcision and how it shows the sign of a covenant between God and the descendants of Abraham. And in my experience, there's a lot of discussion amongst Christians about the weight of faith and works in relation to salvation. Well, for the Jewish people, there was no distinction. If one had faith, they would follow the law. If they followed the law, it showed that they had faith. The two are inseparable. And so circumcision was just the first of many laws and rituals that showed that they were a part of God's people, that they belonged to God, and that God would watch over them. And so I think with any relationship, there is that difference between what I'm saying and what I'm doing. Look at it, for example, in the relationship of marriage, which is another covenant. There's a big difference between telling your spouse that you love them than in doing something that shows that you love them. What do those vows mean? Those promises mean if there is no action to back them up? So what does it mean to love in sickness and in health, in good times and in bad? I think it's about showing, not telling. Which brings us to this other couple who got to entertain God. Up until this point, the stories of the interactions between Abraham and Sarah have usually not ended up well. And yet in this story, under the great oak, we really have a love story in which they are, as the expression goes, unknowingly entertaining angels. And they work together. Sarah is there preparing the bread and the meal, while Abraham goes out into the yard to find the best steer for the barbecue. And they come together and they receive their guests in this show of hospitality. Now that they are no longer trying to figure out things for themselves, but have begun to trust in God. And it shows. It is a joyous and happy occasion. And laughter, which at first is a sign of doubt and surprise, becomes an indication of joy. They are now overjoyed with this news, and that they can, indeed, have this promise of God that they've been waiting for so long. There is also the significance that this is shared around a meal, and this becomes in some ways a sign of the covenant. And there are certainly parallels between these two stories and the covenant that Christians speak about with the meal of the Last Supper and the crucifixion or the passion of Jesus. One is that covenant which involves the blood, the sacrifice, just like the circumcision is, like many ancient covenants, one that involves blood. And yet there's also the meal, the supper, in which they share with the Lord. And here we have both of these things happening in these two stories. There is a covenant which oftentimes will share both sacrifice as well as a meal. And of course, meals are important and remain important in our own lives. We gather with friends and family around food, learn to cook and bake with parents and grandparents, celebrate holidays around the kitchen counter or our table, go on dates at restaurants or cafes, and mark important events with meals and gatherings. And I believe that God loves to share these moments with us. Invite God into our meals. Invite God into your home. And I think perhaps that we too will enjoy the blessings and reap the rewards that he has promised for us. And so we come to the end of our time together today, but I want to thank you for joining me and sticking with me as we have continued to read the stories of Abraham and Sarah. And so next time we'll be looking at what God decides to do with Sodom and Gomorrah. Until then, laugh with God and do good.